Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us online. I'm not sure how many of you caught last week's talk with Naramija Rao, which was a joint event with the Oxford Institute for International Development, but that was a fascinating talk. This evening, we're really pleased that we've been able to get Dr. Doorga here to come and speak to us from the Université de Mascareignes in Mauritius. That's a partner university with the University of Limoges. And previously at Oxford, Jay originally trained as a physicist with a focus on renewable energy. So in a recent paper with Jim Hall and Nick Eyre, Jay set out how to help financial institutions and development actors develop strategies for investments to decarbonize the power sector in Africa, where mainly the countries still depend on fossil fuel for electricity production. The paper recently received the University of Oxford ECM award, and we're very pleased that he's able to be here to tell us about a pathway to enable the conservation of the pristine landscapes in the face of geospatial exploration for renewables. So please, over to you.
Yep. So good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome to this presentation, which is on geospatial optimization and strategic investments in solar and wind, a case of African continent and small island states. I am Jay Doorga. I was a former student here at the University of Oxford, so it's always a great pleasure to be back to the university for a presentation. So I will begin this with by introducing you very briefly to the evolving geospatial context. Actually, following origins of agriculture some 8,000 years ago, human land use has been increasing exponentially. So first beginning in the plains of Mesopotamia and the fertile crescent areas of Southwest Asia, intensive land use patterns begin to develop in India, in China, Africa, South and North America some 2,000 years ago. Actually, land use in Europe and China increased greatly following the developments of cities and towns during the Middle Ages and Renaissance period. However,
Didn't show the screen.
But prior to the Industrial Revolution, pre-industrial agricultural societies appropriated only 4% of a global terrestrial net primary productivity. A relatively small value because societies at those times, they lacked the metabolic means to effectively colonize natural ecosystems. Raised towards modern times, settlement of Americas and Australia led by Europeans started spreading across both continents to the development of a human-dominated world from the onset of the Industrial Revolution, which was in fact enabled by access to dense fossil fuel sources, but also heavy mechanization, and which resulted in further exploitation of our natural ecosystems. So humans were now able to appropriate about 34% of a global terrestrial net primary productivity. So now it would be of interest to get an appreciation of a compositional change of land use during that period, that is from 10,000 years ago to 2018. Actually, the Earth's surface is comprised of 29% land and 71% ocean. Of this 29% land, 71% is regarded as habitable. There is about 10% which comprises of glaciers and about 19% which consists of barren lands. And of this 71% habitable land, this is the compositional change of land use during that period. So it can be seen that about 10,000 years ago, habitable land was mostly dominated by forests, but also wild grasslands and shrubbery. Around the year 1700, global population increased to around 603 million, so an expansion of agricultural lands at the expense of both forested areas, wild grasslands and shrubbery. So agricultural lands increased to about 9%. And in 2018, the greatest land use change was mainly attributed to agriculture, which now made up 46%, with urban land accounting for only 1%. Actually, about 1/3 of our forests and 2/3 of our grasslands have been destroyed through this agricultural land expansion. Then land resource, as we all know, is becoming increasingly scarce. with this agricultural expansion, but also of a socio-economic development. So development projects should instead exploit the barren lands instead of exploiting habitable lands. And this land scarcity issue is being further amplified by the acceleration of economic globalization, which is impacting negatively on global natural ecosystems and also on the availability of land for sustainable projects. So just to mention a few impacts on global ecosystems, actually pressures on ecosystems are mainly due to agriculture, as I've mentioned earlier, but also other socio-economic land uses, for instance, mining, logging, and urban sprawl. It is documented in literature that habitat loss not only affects species directly, but also influences the networks of ecological relationships through space and time by altering abundance and spatial distribution. Habitat destruction due to high land conversion rates is regarded as the main threat to about 85% of species in the IUCN's Red List. So just to mention a few species that went extinct or which are nearly extinct due to the habitat destruction. So for instance, for forest doves, one of them being the Formosan clouded leopard. And this leopard's extinction was attributed to loss and fragmentation of lowland forests on the island of Taiwan, which was replaced by agriculture and which forced the cat to move into even smaller ranges at higher elevation. Another one is the Spix macaw. So this species is declared extinct in the wild, and its extinction is attributed to habitat loss due to agriculture and also energy generation in the lowland forests of Brazil. The third species is the cryptic tree hunter, and this species went extinct as forests became highly fragmented and converted to sugarcane plantations and pasture land in eastern Brazil. Now, some species that went extinct due to wild grassland loss were as follows. So one of them being the Pensidecree. This plant species used to grow in the French department Yonne and went extinct due to limestone quarrying in the vicinity of that region. Another species, the Acalifa, which used to grow in the copper-rich plains of the Diplomatic Republic of Congo, but which went extinct due to copper mining. Also, a beautiful butterfly species, the Xerxes blue, used to be found in the San Francisco Peninsula, but which went extinct again due to fragmentation of grassland and sand dune habitat. So as we can see, this conversion of our natural ecosystems into other socioeconomic land uses has had profound impacts on global species. Now, besides impacts on global ecosystems, there is now an increasing requirements for renewable energy projects. So adding to the list of socioeconomic pressures is this increasing requirement of land space for renewable energy. We all know that we need to decarbonize our global power systems in order to meet our climate targets. Actually, global energy consumption is projected to increase by nearly 50% over the next 30 years, with renewables growing to nearly the same level as petroleum and other liquid fuels. Actually, in the United States alone, over 800,000 kilometers square of land area, which is equivalent to the combined area of UK and France, will be directly impacted by energy development projects by 2040. So we actually all know that this growing renewable energy penetration is crucial for us to meet our climate targets. But the important question that we need to ask ourselves is, will this expanding land use requirements for renewables impact our ability to preserve biodiversity? And in order to answer this question, it would be of interest to go back in time and to look at some of our historical developments. Actually, a quarter of all developments of natural lands in the Massachusetts regions between 2012 to 2017 has been attributed to solar projects. For instance, this is a 6.24 megawatt solar power plant, which resulted in the clearance of so many hectares of forested areas. And interestingly, initially, this historical overlap used to occur mostly in the West, but now many Oriental countries are following the pace. A perfect example for this would be the Wakuya 25 megawatt solar power plant in Japan, and which resulted in the clearance of so many hectares of forested areas. And according to literature, there is about 3,128 renewable energy facilities just like those two, or degrading 886 protected areas, 749 key biodiversity areas, and 40 wilderness areas. Now, besides the increasing land requirements for renewable energy and the impacts on biodiversity, as well as the necessity to meet climate targets, there are other issues that impact the renewable energy investment problem. For instance, political instability. Investors rank political concern highly whenever they are investing in a certain country. For instance, it was reported that an economically viable project, the Inga 3 hydropower plant, faced several development obstructions attributed to unstable situation in the Democratic Republic of Congo. This is one example, but there are many examples in Africa, especially in war-conflicted areas such as Morocco. Another important issue is the policy landscape, because investors, they actually look at appropriate legal and financial systems where they can channel their investments that seek to enhance market rule and reduce associated risks pertaining to investments. Another important issue is the climate conditions, because investors, they would want to invest in renewable energy hotspots that would permit them to maximize yield, maximize profitability, whilst minimizing the space requirements. Last but not least is the institutional capacity, because investors, they would want to invest in a region where there is an established supply chain, or where local contractors have a relevant expertise to carry the project forward. So all the issues that I mentioned here, in the form of political instability, policy landscape, climate conditions, institutional capacity, but also the previous ones that I mentioned, so land use, impacts on biodiversity and climate conditions, all these influence the renewable energy investment program. So it is important to treat this energy investment issue as a multi-criteria problem. That is not only a problem where energy demand is at stake. It is true that we need to cater for the increasing energy demand, and that equitably and sustainably for strategic renewable energy project implementations. But equally important is that we need to address the ecological issue. That is, we need to minimize pressures on biodiversity through less overlapping of renewable energy projects with protected areas, key biodiversity areas, and wilderness areas. Also, we need to meet our climate objective. So our objective is to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. In order to do that, we need rapid decarbonization, strategic rapid decarbonization, in order to achieve maximum decarbonization in the minimum period of time. Also, land issue is yet another important issue, because we need to account for the limited land resources, which is being shared with other socio-economic needs due to the growing food industry, as I mentioned earlier, but also due to urban expansion. So all the issues that I mentioned here, they're mostly global issues because they affect the global commons. But there are also other issues, but mostly from an investor perspective. One of them being the political instability, because investors rank political concerns highly whenever they are investing in a certain region. Also important is the economy, because investors, they actually would like to invest in a country where the capital investment costs are not as high as that. So we need to account for factors that seek to reduce the capital investment costs. Technological potential is yet another important issue, because investors, they would want to invest in countries where there are adequate natural resources and geotechnical conditions that would enable efficient implementation of their projects. The institutional capacity also is extremely important, because investors would want to invest in a country where there is an established supply chain to make best use of investments. So as I mentioned earlier, the four issues to the left, they are from an investor perspective, whilst the four issues to the right are mostly global issues. And both issues from an investor perspective and global issues are important and interconnected in this energy investment program. So actually now I will be applying this framework on a continental scale, so for the case of Africa. But before applying it, it would be of interest to get an appreciation of the African energy context. So the African population is expected to double by 2050 to reach about 2.4 billion. And this growing population, coupled to the rate of urbanization, is posing a major threat to our future climate, especially if Africa has to adopt the economic model of the West. So the lion's share of electricity generation in Africa mostly comes from fossil fuels, which makes up 79% of a centralized electricity grid. So it is important that the African power sector transitions away from a potential fossil fuel lock-in. And this situation is being further amplified by the over-reliance of many African countries on fossil fuel imports, but also fossil fuel exports, which has tremendous repercussions on the financial structures which make up the African countries. Fortunately, utility-scale solar and wind, they represent valuable substitutes to fossil fuel-derived electricity with massive cost reductions over the years. So for solar, the cost dropped by 69%, whilst for wind, it dropped by 18% between 2010 to 2016. Actually, grid extension and densification represents the most cost-effective way of supplying electricity to nearly 45% of population by 2030. So this current case study will be exploring the potential for utility-scale, grid-connected solar PV and wind for strategic energy investments. So now it would be of interest to get an appreciation of the investment landscape globally. So these green dots and yellow dots, they represent the energy investments made worldwide. And can you see that Africa has been the recipient of the most spatially dense amount of investments globally between 2005 and 2015. In fact, the main investments made in Africa mostly come from four main sources, one of them being the World Bank, which invests around 17.6 billion, mainly in fossil fuels in sub-Saharan Africa. There is the European Union, which invests around 16.8 billion, mainly in renewable energy in North Africa. The African Development Bank injects around 14.4 billion in distribution infrastructures across the continent. But there is a fourth category, so other players, but to play a far smaller roles than the three that I mentioned above. For instance, the United States, China, Climate Investment Fund, the Arab Fund, the OPEC Fund. So all these play a significant role in the energy investment issue of Africa. However, the African Progress Panel posits that the excessive fragmentation with regards to the investment made, coupled with the poor coordination with regards to the donors who are investing in this region, results in inefficient investments in the African power sector. But it's extremely important to invest strategically in the African continent, especially considering that there are rolling blackouts caused by aging coal power plants in South Africa, diminishing gas reserves in North Africa, and poor energy infrastructures in sub-Saharan Africa. All these coupled with the fact that the African population is a young, growing population and will impact the climate in the few years to come. So actually, the investment made, for instance, by the African Development Bank in collaboration with the Climate Investment Funds are as follows. So the African Development Bank is implementing in entirety of a Climate Investment Fund and so supported development of 39 investment plans across 27 countries with the objective of unlocking climate action. So actually, the African Development Bank has approved up to date a total of 33 projects, so around $945 million in CIF resources and about $1,988 million of its own co-financing. Actually, these are where the investments are being made. These are the different kinds of programs which are existing. So for instance, this is the Forest Investment Program, but programs which are relevant to the renewable energy sector, one of them being the Clean Technology Fund. So a Clean Technology Fund is to finance the deployment and transfer of low carbon technologies with significant potential for long-term greenhouse gas emission savings in emerging economies. And these have been mostly channeled to Egypt, South Africa, Nigeria, and Morocco. Another important program is the Scaling Up Renewable Energy Program in low-income countries, which seeks to deploy renewable energy solutions and expand renewable energy markets in world's poorest countries. And these have been aimed, for instance, in Mali, Kenya, Tanzania, and Madagascar. But the important question is to ask ourselves, are these the optimum sites for investments to support both programs from a climate action perspective? In order to actually look whether these are the viable sites, I will apply the Multicriteria framework, which I've shown you just earlier. So for a demand, from a global issues perspective, so whilst considering energy demand, we considered monthly outages and access to electricity factors with two different perspectives. One of them being from a philanthropic perspective, that is investors who are motivated to improve the electricity situation of a country. Because investors who would want to improve the electricity situation of a country would want to invest around these regions where the monthly outages are high and access to electricity are low, because those represent tremendous potential to boost the energy infrastructures of the sub-Saharan region here. Another way to look at the energy demand issue is to invest, actually it is called the financial investment perspective. It is to invest in regions where investors can seek financial assurance for their project investments. And those investors would want to invest where monthly power outages are low and access to electricity is high, because these are typical of grid infrastructures which are stable and therefore would be able to generate, those investors would be able to generate revenues for their investments, whilst meeting the energy demand issue. Now for the ecology issue, we first of all identified protected areas and regions of high net primary productivity and remove them from our analysis because we do not want renewable energy investments to impact biodiversity zones. So we remove them from our analysis. We accounted for land issues. Other socio-economic and technical land constraints were identified and removed from our analysis. And last, but mostly the most important, is the climate issue. So we use the fossil fuel electricity generation. So our strategy was to identify countries which are heavily reliant on fossil fuels, because these countries represent countries with the highest decarbonization potentials. Then we can drive renewable energy in those countries and diversify the energy mix. So these are the factors that we did take into consideration from the global issues perspective. Now, the factors that we took into consideration from an investor side perspective, so the institutional factor. So we did consider solar PV and wind total capacity as a proxy for the institutional capacity of a country, because with high installed capacities would have developed the necessary expertise and established the supply chain to make best use of investments. For the technological potential, we actually looked at the combination of climatic conditions that seek to optimize yield. For instance, for solar investment, we would look at combinations of solar radiation and temperature that would seek to optimize on solar yield, while for wind investment, we would look at wind speed, so geospatially how it varies. For the economy issue, we accounted for factors that seek to minimize the capital cost of investments by using existing existing infrastructures. For instance, proximity to grid network, proximity to road network, proximity to settlement areas, so that investors will not have to invest too much on new infrastructures, as well as take into consideration the slope factor, so that investors will not have to invest on land resurfacing. For the political concern issue, we did first of all exclude disputed territories of Western Sahara and Somaliland, and we used the OECD's country risk classification as a proxy for the political stability and suitable investment setting. Because by definition, the OECD's country risk classification captures the risk associated with the investment structure in place, as well as war and civil disturbance. So all the factors that I mentioned here were then combined in order to reveal propitious sites where investments can be channeled. So the framework that helped us to do that is called the Multicriteria decision analysis framework. And it permits us to obtain a metric which actually dictates where it is more propitious to invest geospatially. Actually, how do we do that is the different factors. They are first of all georeferenced to align them on the same geospatial frame. We then reclassify those factors on a common scale. We attribute a certain weightage to individual factors here based on the influence in the renewable energy investment issue. We apply a weighted linear combinatorial model to combine those different factors influencing investments. We remove geospatial constraints in order to obtain a map delineating where it is more propitious to invest geospatially. The red regions are the regions of high investment potentials, green regions are the very low investment potentials, and black regions are the prohibited sites for investments. We did perform a sensitivity analysis for completeness sake on the socio-economic parameters. For instance, we did account for grid network expansion, road network expansion, and expansion of settlement areas owing to the uncertainties in the formulation of the model itself. And we did find that there was no significant change geospatially, which is indicative of a fairly robustly built model. So our results for solar and wind from a financial investor perspective, that is, investors would want to seek financial assurance for their projects. For solar investments, we did find that South Africa and Egypt were best for solar, because those countries they witnessed very high insolation of the order of 250 watts per meter square, so a very high yield. In terms of, they also have high rate of successful PV projects. Sorry. It's all right. It's good. Okay, so they also have high rates of successful PV projects, which means that over the years, we have established the market and the relevant expertise to make best use of investments. We also rely heavily on coal for South Africa and gas and diesel for Egypt, which means that there is tremendous decarbonization potential. in order to invest renewable energy in these countries. They have low monthly power outages and high access to electricity, which means that they have an established energy infrastructures. Also, they are relatively politically stable countries. Now, for wind investments, we did find that Algeria and South Africa, the western coast of South Africa, are best for wind potential, because those regions, they witness very strong winds of greater than 10 meters per second at 150 meters height, so high yield. High installed wind capacity, so they have established the market there to make best use of investments. They rely heavily on coal, gas, and diesel for electricity generation. So highest decarbonization potential, and again, low monthly power outages, high access to electricity, and relatively politically stable countries. Now, looking at it from a philanthropic perspective, so investors who would want to improve the electricity situation of those countries. So in both, they would want to invest around this region, sub-Saharan region of Niger and Chad, because these regions, they are blessed with very good climatic conditions in the form of high insolation, not as high as Egypt or South Africa, but comparatively high. So high insolation, strong winds. Also, they have intermediate rate of successful PV projects. So they have a market which is kickstarting at the moment. They have high monthly, and importantly, they have high monthly outages and low access to electricity, which means that those countries, they do lack the adequate electricity infrastructures to actually improve, and therefore investors can really improve the energy situation of those countries, actually. So when we compare the results that we've had previously with the mapping of investments made by the African Development Bank in coordination with the climate investment funds. So these are the mapping of investment projects from the AFDB and CIF. Actually, AFDB and CIF mostly channel those investments to Egypt, South Africa, Nigeria, and Morocco. But when comparing it with our results, the observations that we note is that we need to be really cautious when investing in the Western Sahara region. They do invest in the whole region, but the Western Sahara region is a highly disputed region where lots of solar projects have had major obstructions and hurdles. Therefore, this is one observation that we found. Another observation is that this program, the Clean Technology Fund, aims at making significant greenhouse gas savings, but Nigeria has a weak energy infrastructures. So we were asking ourselves whether these networks, they are the best countries to invest geospatially for the Clean Technology Fund program. Another observation is that we did find that, for instance, the AFDB and CIF would channel those finances in Mali, in Tanzania, Kenya, and Madagascar. But in our analysis, we did find that the region of Niger and Chad have higher potentials and low access to electricity. Therefore, it would be make more sense for them to be part of the SREP program from a climate action and philanthropic perspectives. Now, we did a more refined analysis at measure levels. So we did identify South Africa as being best for wind. So this is a more refined analysis at measure levels for Africa, South Africa. The red regions are very high investment potential regions. The green regions are the very low investment potentials, and black regions are the prohibited sites for investments. So we did find that the construction of wind farms in the very high investment potential sites here is around $50 per megawatt hour, which means that investors investing in these regions can generate profits of the order of 16.7% when investing in coal-fired power stations. And we did find for Egypt, this is a more refined analysis at geospatial levels. And actually, for the case of Egypt, the red regions are very high investment potential sites. And we found that the construction of solar farms in the very high investment potential sites is around $58 per megawatt hour, which means that investors can generate profits of the order of 29.7% when investing in combined cycle gas turbines and 37% when investing in diesel generators. And in fact, it is even cheaper to invest in solar farms in the worst sites in Egypt than to invest in combined cycle gas turbines and diesel generators. However, these are economic analyses, but while the financial viability of renewable energy investments in hotspots are favorable, it is extremely important to dismantle political, institutional, and technical barriers which prevent those adoption of these technologies. So having applied it at the continental level, now I will apply it at the small island scale level just to observe a nuance. So these are the cases which we are taking into consideration. So Hawaii in the Pacific, Mauritius and Rodrigues in the Indian Ocean. But generally, most islands, they are heavily reliant on fossil fuels for electricity generation. So for the case of these three, it is greater than 75%. We also have land constraint issues. So those islands face significant land constraint issues due to the diminishing land area attributed to sea level rise. Also, however, they are blessed with quite a rich biodiversity because they have high level of variety and endemism, which is attributed to their remoteness and marginal levels of development. So now I will be applying the same framework which I've applied for African continental scale at the small island state level. But it is important to note that for the small islands scale, factors which include political stability, institutional setting, energy demand, and decarbonization priorities, they do not vary significantly on geospatial levels. Therefore, we can remove them. What is more important at small island level are the ecology issue and the land issue. So for the ecology issue, we identify, for instance, native biota, nature reserves, and forests, and excluded them from our analysis because we do not want renewable energy projects to impact on these biodiversity hotspots. For the land issue, we did identify other socio-economic land uses, for instance, settlement areas, airport sites, etc., and remove them from our analysis. For the technological potential issue, we did identify how climatic conditions vary geospatially, because especially at island level, there are distinct microclimate regimes which prevail geospatially, which would optimize yield. Therefore, we did identify how climatic conditions prevail geospatially. Also, we did account for the economy issue by factoring in proximity to infrastructures and adequate slopes in order to minimize the capital investment costs from the point of view of investors. So these are the different issues that we looked at. And again, we applied the multi-criteria decision analysis process by combining those different factors and removing geospatial constraints for Mauritius, for Hawaii, and for Rodrigues. And actually, our results are as follows. So this is a renewable energy investment mapping at island level. So the very high investment potential sites are red, very low investment potential sites are green, and black regions are prohibited sites for investments. And this has been permitted through this multi-criteria decision analysis framework, which I've shown you earlier. And it has helped us to obtain a metric which helps us identify strategic regions where to invest. And this metric does not only take into consideration one factor, that is factors that seek to optimize yield, but it takes into consideration a spectrum of factors. That is factors that seek to optimize yield, factors that seek to decrease land exploitation, factors that seek to reduce pressures on biodiversity, whilst accounting for competing socioeconomic needs, and also factors that seek to reduce capital investment costs from the point of view of investors. So all of these are taken into consideration to obtain a metric which dictates propitiousness where investment should be channeled. And more importantly, at island level, it helps us address the land and the biodiversity issue in an expanding renewable energy context. Specifically for the land issue, this MCDA framework helps us identify optimum areas where to invest, that is, where to maximize yield in the minimum space possible. For instance, this is an analysis that we did for the big island of Hawaii, and we did find that investing in the Waimea region here would necessitate less land requirements than investing in the Hilo region here for the same energy generation output, which can result in massive land savings of the order of 30%, which is highly relevant at island level with land scarcity issues. Another important aspect that MCDA frameworks help us obtain is that MCDA frameworks enables identification of less productive lands outside of key biodiversity areas where renewable energy investment would impact less on biodiversity. For instance, this is an analysis we did for Rodrigues, and the yellow boxes are propitious sites for solar investments. And by further probing into those sites, we did find that they are mostly characteristic of barren lands, rather than the more productive agricultural lands and forested areas. So this has been enabled through this MCDA framework. So to summarize my point, from the continental level to the island level, so while the context may be different, because at the continental scale, what we are looking at is to identify strategic regions for effective decarbonization. by factoring in political institutional concerns that would enable us to foster coordination among a set of donors. Whilst at the island level, what we are mostly looking at is to identify strategic regions where land use exploitation and biodiversity issues are minimized in order to enable us to conserve pristine landscapes. So while the context may be different, this MCDA framework is extremely important because it treats the renewable energy investment issue as a multi-criteria problem, as an interconnected problem where not only energy demand is at stake, but the ecology issue is an extremely important issue, as well as land factors, climate conditions, the political, socio-economic, and institutional settings. All these are important in the energy investment problem. So now I would like to end this presentation with the following quote from Pope Francis in his address to the United Nations Assembly, which I quote: "The future demands of us critical decisions in the face of worldwide conflicts, which increase the number of excluded and those in need," unquote. Therefore, this multi-criteria framework, which I've introduced you, is extremely important, especially for the renewable energy investments, because it permits the inclusion of several spheres of a human existence, from the environmental to the socio-political institutional settings for strategic and effective investments. These are my references. Thank you very much for your attention.
I'll just stop sharing the screen if I can.
Yes.
And one of the things that strikes me most of all about that is the manner in which conflicted land is taken out, not only of agricultural use, but also it's no longer possible to use that for renewable energy. So have you got a feeling the proportion of land that's affected? You showed Morocco and part of the east, the Horn of Africa area. So how big an effect is that disputed territory in terms of taking out productive renewable energy space?
Yeah, actually the disputed territories, it does not occupy a lot of space. Actually, there are a couple of disputed territories like Western Sahara and Somaliland. It does not affect significantly, but if you actually look quite specifically in the analysis, you will see that Morocco is a very high investment potential site due to its solar very high insulation potential. So it's a very high investment potential site, but the problem is that many investment projects, they actually face great obstructions there because of the war conflicted areas. So it's not significant on geospatial levels, but actually these places where solar is maximum, actually Morocco is one of the best places for solar, but it's a war conflicted area. Yeah.
Do you have any questions from the room?
I mean, yeah, maybe one question. How do your results relate to net zero scenarios? So obviously this is a bit of a snapshot of what's happening now and what sort of investment makes sense now. Do you have a perspective of sort of the restrictions or the implications that your results have on global net zero scenarios?
Yeah, how do the results relate to global net zero? Actually, it would make more sense to actually invest in regions geospatially where the decarbonization potential of countries is highest. So in our analysis, we did find, for instance, South Africa and Egypt, they have a very carbon intensive grids. So our analysis, we did find that it would make more sense and it is economically valuable to invest in those countries. So strategic investments will actually first begin in those countries, so Egypt and South Africa, and then move to other countries because those countries, they have the highest decarbonization potentials. So in terms of our net zero plan, it would make us actually be closer to net zero if we invest first in those countries than to invest in countries where it is.
This I see, but I'm more wondering, like, basically, are we in trouble when it comes to land availability for net zero?
Land availability issues are not a significant problem in Africa. No. It's not a significant problem. Though there are highly endemic biodiversity hotspots in Africa, but the major problem in Africa is the political and institutional setting. And also the market, which does not permit this uptake of renewable energy investments. You know, for instance, whenever investors are investing in Africa, it takes a long time for investment. It's a lengthy procedure. So this is the major hurdle for the African context. Yeah. Strategic investments is not an issue.
So we have a question online, and I'm hoping Nick Jelly will be able to turn his camera on.
Yeah, he said I've given you the permission to do that.
Just trying to turn the full screen. Yeah.
Hello.
Yes, we can
Thank
hear
you. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I just wondered about, I got the impression that one of the criteria was access to a grid.
Yeah.
But it would seem that there might be possibilities for off-grid, particularly in certain regions of Africa. Could you comment on the relative, sorry, they've got an echo here, sorry. Comment on the relative opportunities for investment in off-grid compared to grid solar?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for your question. Actually, yeah, our analysis, what we did is that we did a like a utility scale grid connected analysis. It was mostly for solar farms and solar and wind farms, but we actually didn't do like an analysis for off-grid opportunities. Of course, in Africa, these off-grid opportunities are extremely important and extremely relevant, especially in countries which do lack the infrastructures to actually tap into the renewable energy potential. Yeah, of course, it would be great. But our analysis mostly focused on utility scale grid connected solar PV and wind for strategic energy investments.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Nick. I had another question which concerns Morocco. I don't know if you've read recently, but Octopus Energy Ventures, I believe it is, working with X-Links, are talking about installing solar farm on the Moroccan coast and then investing in electricity link from there to the southwest part of England to develop an energy supply, particularly for heating purposes in the UK. So I'm just asking, in your model, had you expected any form of electricity supply exporting electricity from the continent of Africa?
Yeah, actually, in our model formulation, our main assumption is that we would restrict it to the African continent. But of course, Morocco is actually one of the highest, like the most optimum sites with regards to solar. So actually, in our analysis, to be honest, we did find that Morocco was better than Egypt, actually. But because of this war conflicted situation, we had to eliminate Morocco. Yeah, the Western Sahara region. Yeah, but Morocco is like, it's an optimum place where to invest. And therefore, it would make sense actually to export this electricity, maybe to European countries. Yeah, it would be great.
I think it's interesting they're suggesting that maybe a UK investor firm would be considering to make an investment into that region despite the political instability. Sure. So is there anything that renewable energy resources can do to help drive stability by allowing lands to become more productive for generating revenues?
Yeah, in terms of, for instance, how renewable energy can help. The problem is that, like I showed earlier, it's like renewable energy are impacting significantly on biodiversity. So to make it more productive, maybe like there are certain practices which are being currently done in the UK, for instance. They do like solar panels with other activities like farming, etc. But these practices is not adopted, for instance, in African countries. So this is a great opportunity to make best use, like two activities on only one plot of land. Yeah, this would be a great opportunity.
So I'm just checking if we have any more questions online. If you want to raise a hand.
From
Oh, yes, okay. Seema, do you want to turn your camera and your microphone off, please?
Yeah, hi. The question is, how did you identify parcels of land available for renewable generation, considering all the factors like including the land ownership and also the political?
Sorry,
Yeah, I'm afraid the sound's not very good this end, Seema. Could you just speak?
I just turned off my camera probably, yeah. So how did you, is it better now?
No, it's more of an echo at this end. Could you just speak very slowly and see if we can catch the question again, please?
Yeah, how did you identify? Can you hear now?
Yes,
yeah.
thank you.
So how did you identify parcels of land available for renewable generation, considering all the factors, including ownership and things like that?
Yeah, actually, our geospatial analysis, we did not did refined analysis on whether those lands they are actually owned by the public or owned by the state. Actually, it was more like a macro level analysis. Even for the case of South Africa, we did not look deep into those different aspects of the land parcels. So whatever we did is to exclude biodiversity hotspots and exclude central materials, but those factors, they were already available. These geospatial factors, they are available online, and you can download them. It is available on the World Bank website. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question. I think that brings me to the kind of question at the end of it. Is this tool going to be used to inform investment decisions made by African Development Bank or others?
Yeah, actually, I've got a couple of comments, mostly from folks who have been contacting me, etc., to try to use this study and to try to maybe get into people who are investing, like foreigners who are investing. And I really hope that this piece of work will be really applicable for African context, but especially for the case of my country, Mauritius. We are doing a lot of groundwork to apply the research that we are doing at policy level in order to influence and dictate these investments at the right places. Because small islands, they are endemic sites. They have a lot of endemic biodiversity hotspots. So this is why it is extremely crucial to actually plan very well the investments that are being made.
That's fantastic. And I hope those of you, oh, sorry, one more question.
Maybe one more question that's related to this.
Sure.
What about private investments in Africa? Can these fields also be used to deploy more private investment?
Yeah, especially for the private investments. For solar and wind, especially for the East African countries, I did not find a lot of private investors. For instance, recently in the Eastern African region, most investments have been mostly recently in wave energy, not in solar and wind. So there is a certain category of investors who are investing in certain parts of Africa. Yeah, but for solar, I guess that most of the investments are going to South Africa, Egypt, Morocco, but not sub-Saharan Africa. So there is a market for certain types of investments. Yeah.
Well, I hope those of you online will be able to join as well, as we thank Jay very much for his presentation this afternoon. Just a quick word about next week, if that's okay. So I'll just come in. We'll be hearing next week from Tim Stone, who is chair of the Nuclear Industry Association, and he'll be reflecting on the recent UK government announcement about energy security. And Tim promises to offer a non-partisan examination of the GB energy system. He says he's going to be taking perspectives from both inside and outside Whitehall, so I'm looking forward to that. So thanks again for joining us online, and have a good evening. Thanks again, John. Yeah, so